June 6, 1944. 6:35 hours. Normandy coast. The men of the British 3rd Division crouched low against the shingle bank as the air filled with the sound they would never forget. A mechanical shriek, rattling at nearly 1,200 rounds a minute, the MG-42, Hitler's buzzsaw. It tore the air in streams of invisible fire, mowing down any figure who dared rise above the sand. Private diaries describe the sensation not as gunfire, but as a continuous ripping scream. To the defenders in the concrete casemates overlooking Sword, Juno, and Gold, the men on the beaches were little more than silhouettes in a rifle range. Infantry had been drilled to charge bunkers with grenades, Bangalore torpedoes, or flamethrowers. But in Normandy, German defenses were not sandbag emplacements, they were reinforced concrete shells 2 meters thick, with interlocking fields of MG-42 fire. American Rangers at Point du Hoc and Canadian infantry at Courcelles learned within minutes that rifle fire, even from supporting Shermans, barely chipped the embrasures. The Germans had prepared too well. It was in this crucible that a strange machine rumbled ashore behind the waves of infantry. To those who had never seen it before, it looked like an ordinary Churchill tank, tall-sided, clanking forward at a steady crawl. But mounted to its hull was a weapon no army had ever fielded in this way before, a stubby, brutish mortar, almost comically oversized, pointing slightly upwards. This was the AVRE, Armored Vehicle Royal Engineers, and its gun was not a gun at all. It was the 290mm Petard spigot mortar, a siege weapon loaded with a projectile so massive the crews nicknamed it the Flying Dustbin. The Dustbin was a 40-pound demolition bomb, a squat cylinder filled with high explosive. Its maximum range was little more than 150 yards, but range was irrelevant when the target was a bunker spitting fire at point-blank distance. Combat engineers, riding inside the Churchill's armor, could traverse within spitting distance of a concrete nest, fire a single round, and reduce it to rubble in seconds. Royal Engineer Major Alan Beck, writing in his post-war notes, remembered the first time his squadron used one against a fortified position. We had been pinned for hours by machine guns dug into a farmhouse with thick walls. One round from the Petard, the entire gable end folded in. The Germans inside never fired again. The infantry were so stunned they cheered the tank as if it were a battleship come to save them. On D-Day itself, infantrymen described scenes where entire German strongpoints were wiped out as if erased. Canadian units advancing off Juno recalled one bunker that had already absorbed shell after shell from naval guns and Shermans, still firing its MG-42s. When an AVRE finally rolled forward, its crew exposed themselves to reload the massive bomb, slammed the Petard shut, and fired. The explosion did not echo like artillery, it thumped, a concussive blast that could be felt in the chest. Dust and concrete erupted. When it cleared, there was no more gunfire from the slit. The MG-42, with its terrifying cadence, was designed to dominate the battlefield through sheer psychological shock. The Petard mortar answered in kind. Its sound was not staccato but singular, a single, obliterating detonation that reduced steel shutters and reinforced embrasures to wreckage. German accounts collected after the war show defenders had no countermeasure. One Oberstfreiter of the 352nd Infantry Division later told interrogators, "We had no weapon for these tanks. The machine guns fired, the artillery fired, but when the Petard came, it was over. The bunker itself was destroyed, not just the men." Here lay the crux of the Allied solution. Conventional tanks could duel other tanks, artillery could soften areas. But against fixed machine gun nests and concrete works, only the AVRE could erase them in one blow. Infantrymen, trapped in the killing zones of MG-42 fire, would later remember that whenever a Flying Dustbin arrived, the battle changed in an instant. Normandy's beaches demanded more than courage. They demanded engineering, brutal, direct, and improvised for a task no standard weapon could perform. The Petard mortar was ungainly, awkward to reload, and dangerously short-ranged. But on June 6, 1944, it proved its worth. Against the shriek of the MG-42, it delivered silence. The Churchill AVRE did not spring from an armory catalogue but from desperation. In 1942, as British planners studied the failure of Dieppe, one conclusion was clear: conventional weapons could not crack concrete. The Germans had learned to turn France's coast into a fortress, a wall not of steel but of bunkers and MG-42s. Infantry storming a beach without specialized support would be massacred. The answer came from a Canadian engineer, Major J.S. Hobo Anderson of the Royal Canadian Engineers, who proposed an armored vehicle that could bring combat engineers directly to the obstacle. The Churchill tank was chosen as the platform. Slow, ungainly, but with thick armor and ample interior space, it could carry both men and machines. The new creation was called AVRE, Armored Vehicle Royal Engineers. Its defining feature was the Petard mortar. Unlike a conventional tank gun, this was a spigot mortar, a weapon that fired a projectile from a fixed rod instead of a barrel. The shell itself, the 290 mm demolition charge, weighed 40 pounds and resembled a steel bucket. Crews quickly nicknamed it the Flying Dustbin. Loaded from outside the turret, the bomb had to be slid into the weapon by hand. In combat, this meant the commander or loader had to expose himself briefly, a dangerous but necessary act. But when fired, the effect was devastating. British Army Ordnance records described its explosive yield as equivalent to a 6-inch artillery shell, delivered at point-blank range. Range was limited to about 80 to 150 yards, but within that envelope, the weapon could obliterate bunkers, pillboxes, roadblocks, or even armored vehicles. Field manuals stressed its purpose bluntly: the Petard is not a weapon of precision, but of absolute demolition. The engineering team did not stop there. AVREs could be fitted with an array of attachments designed for the specialized nightmare of an invasion coast. Fascines, giant bundles of logs, could be carried on the hull to fill trenches. Bobbin rollers could unspool matting for vehicles to cross soft sand. Some carried small bridges, others mounted plows for mine clearing. Together, these contraptions formed what historian Ken Ford later called Hobart's Funnies, named after Major General Percy Hobart, commander of the 79th Armored Division, who championed their development. It was Hobart who insisted that innovation, no matter how eccentric, was essential. His division became a workshop of experimental vehicles: flail tanks with whirling chains to detonate mines, amphibious swimming Shermans, crocodile flamethrower Churchills. But among them, the AVRE Flying Dustbin earned a reputation as the most direct answer to the German MG-42 nest. Soldier testimonies highlight the psychological relief the AVREs brought. One Royal Engineer in Normandy wrote in his diary, "Every man feared the Buzzsaw. It cut through walls, through hedgerows, through our nerves. When the AVREs came up and loosed a dustbin, you could almost feel the German courage collapse with the bunker." German reports captured after the war confirmed this perception. A war diary of the 716th Infantry Division at Can records, on June 8, 1944, enemy heavy tanks fired special bomb-type shells at our positions. Fortified machine gun posts were destroyed in a single shot. Morale of troops severely shaken. What made the Flying Dustbin unique was its efficiency. Where naval gunfire or heavy artillery required ranging shots, coordination, and massive logistics, a single AVRE could roll forward, under fire and deliver demolition in seconds. Combat engineers did not need to storm a bunker with satchel charges, they simply let the tank do the work. Lockheed records show the U.S. built thousands of P-38 Lightnings during the same period, a marvel of American airpower. Britain, lacking such vast capacity, funneled its innovation into niche tools like the AVRE. Each was handmade, adapted, and often modified in the field. Production numbers were modest, a few hundred by 1944, but their impact was measured not in quantity but in decisive moments, where one round altered the fate of an entire platoon pinned on a beach. By D-Day, the 79th Armored Division had trained rigorously with infantry brigades to synchronize AVRE support. The plan was precise. When MG-42s halted infantry, AVREs would advance to within dustbin range, fire, and then clear obstacles for the follow-up assault. The weapon was too clumsy for duels and too short-ranged for sweeping bombardments, but in its narrow role, it was unparalleled. in the words of one Canadian sergeant who survived Juno Beach. "Without the flying dustbin, we'd have been stuck on the sand. With it, the bunkers disappeared." That's the truth. When the first wave of Allied infantry surged ashore on June 6, 1944, the grim prophecies of Dieppe seemed to be repeating themselves. The beaches of Normandy were littered with steel obstacles, deep minefields, and above all, German strongpoints manned by MG-42 crews who unleashed streams of fire at anything that moved. For the Canadians at Juno and the British at Sword, survival in those first hours often came down to one factor: whether or not the AVREs made it off their landing craft. The sea was rough, and the ungainly Churchills, with their overloaded frames, lumbered off the ramps with difficulty. Some sank outright when water surged over their bows. Others hit mines before they reached dry sand. Yet those that did survive became the spearhead of the assault. Their task was not glamorous: no sweeping tank duel, no charge across open fields, but cold, mechanical demolition. On Sword Beach, the 5th Assault Regiment, Royal Engineers, recorded in its war diary: "Infantry halted by heavy automatic fire from a casemate position at La Brèche. AVRE advanced under fire, fired one petard round, emplacement completely demolished. Infantry advanced without loss." The description is laconic, but survivors remembered it vividly. A platoon pinned for half an hour suddenly saw the steel bunker vanish in an explosion that seemed to swallow the very earth. The MG-42, the dreaded Hitler's Buzzsaw, was silent. The petard was awkward, slow to reload, and required nerve-wracking exposure. Yet, in those moments, it was unmatched. A German strongpoint might take hours of naval shelling or a full assault with satchel charges. The AVRE did it with one shot. At Juno Beach, Canadian forces faced a particularly stubborn set of defenses around Courcelles-sur-Mer. Lieutenant J. McLeod of the 26th Assault Squadron described the action in his post-operation report. Strongpoint WN-31 contained 2 machine gun positions firing upon the Queen's Own rifles. One AVRE approached within 70 yards. Fired dustbin. Position obliterated. Second emplacement engaged and destroyed with a second round. Infantry advanced immediately. Captured German documents confirm this. The war diary of the 736th Grenadier Regiment notes: "Our machine gun positions could not withstand enemy engineer tanks. Large bomb-type shells destroyed casemates entirely. Resistance in sector collapsed." These early successes came at a cost. AVRE crews operated under constant sniper and artillery fire. Loading a petard meant opening the turret hatch, hauling the 40-pound projectile into position, and slotting it onto the spigot, a process that could take nearly half a minute. Many loaders were killed in the act, struck by shrapnel or machine gun bursts. Yet their comrades pressed on, understanding that without them, entire infantry companies might never advance. As the battle pushed inland, AVREs grew into their full role. In the village fighting around Caen, where the Germans turned every farmhouse and crossroads into a fortress, the flying dustbin became the Allies' blunt instrument of choice. Infantry reports speak of progress being measured house by house until an AVRE arrived, loosed its bomb, and reduced the strongpoint to rubble. One dramatic case occurred on June 11 during the assault on Lebacy Woods. German paratroopers of the 21st Panzer Division had entrenched in a walled orchard. Rifle and Bren fire did nothing, mortars only scratched the surface. An AVRE rolled forward under covering fire, stopped within 100 yards, and launched a dustbin straight into the orchard wall. Survivors described a thunderclap and cloud of dust. When the debris settled, the MG-42 was gone, the paratroopers either dead or dazed, and the infantry moved through the gap without a single casualty. It was this ability to erase a fortified point instantly that made the AVRE indispensable. Allied commanders quickly recognized that progress against German fieldworks depended not on overwhelming firepower alone, but on the peculiar talents of Hobart's Funnies. A Canadian corporal later recalled, "The Germans said no one could beat the MG-42. They were right, no rifleman could. But the AVRE wasn't a rifleman. It was the hammer. When it hit, there was nothing left. By the time the Normandy lodgment was secure, the Flying Dustbin had earned its place in legend. It was ugly, slow, and dangerous to operate, but on the beaches of France, it silenced the weapon that had once seemed unstoppable. By late July 1944, the Normandy campaign had transformed from a desperate beachhead fight into a grinding push inland. The German defenses, though battered, retained their backbone in fortified towns, crossroad strongpoints, and the notorious bocage country. For infantrymen advancing against these positions, the MG-42 remained a constant menace. For the AVRE, the next stage of the war offered both greater opportunities and harsher trials. One of the most vivid examples came during Operation Charnwood, the British assault on Caen. The Germans had fortified entire blocks with interlocking fields of fire. Standard infantry tactics faltered. On July 8, the 77th Assault Squadron, Royal Engineers, brought AVREs forward alongside the 3rd Infantry Division. A platoon pinned in front of a stone farmhouse reported, "No advance possible." MGs firing continuously from slit and wall. An AVRE approached within 60 yards, its thick armor shrugging off small arms fire. The Petard roared. The Flying Dustbin punched straight into the stone facade. Witnesses described the building disintegrating in a geyser of rubble. The German gun was gone. Infantry surged past. The squadron diary summed up with understatement, "Obstacle removed." German records reflect their frustration. A captured report from the 16th Luftwaffe Field Division, tasked with holding Caen's northern sector, notes, "Engineer tanks are especially feared. Our heavy machine guns cannot disable them. They fire large explosive shells at close range, destroying bunkers in one strike. Morale is badly shaken when these tanks appear." This pattern repeated across Normandy. At Villers-Bocage, at Tilly-sur-Seulles, at countless unnamed hedgerows, the Flying Dustbin was used not in sweeping armored maneuvers but in slow, deliberate acts of demolition. It was a battlefield scalpel wielded like a sledgehammer. As the Allies broke out of Normandy and raced across France in August 1944, AVREs faced a new challenge: speed. The lumbering Churchills, never designed for rapid advances, often struggled to keep pace with Sherman columns. Yet whenever the front stalled before a fortified village, engineers called for the Funnies. At the Seine crossings, AVREs equipped with fascines and small bridges enabled infantry to storm across anti-tank ditches. At Le Havre in September, they proved indispensable. Le Havre was declared a fortress by Hitler, to be defended to the last man. The German commander, Admiral Hanecke, had machine gun bunkers, pillboxes, and flak towers all covering one another. Conventional artillery failed to dislodge them. The 79th Armored Division was brought in. Over 3 days of fighting, AVREs rolled up to the perimeter under smoke cover. Petard rounds blasted gaps in concrete walls and silenced MG-42 nests. After the battle, British engineers tallied more than 60 strongpoints destroyed by direct AVRE fire. One sergeant remembered, "We fired into embrasures no bigger than a man's head. If you hit, the whole bunker blew apart. If you missed, you reloaded and tried again." But in the end, the Germans surrendered because their guns were gone. Moving into Belgium and the Low Countries, the AVREs faced perhaps their toughest challenge, the fortified Scheldt estuary. German troops defending Antwerp's approaches used the terrain to maximum advantage. Every dike, farmhouse, and lock gate became a firing position. MG-42s swept the flatlands with deadly arcs. The muddy ground bogged down tanks, and infantry alone would have been cut to pieces. Here again, the Petard proved its worth. At Breskens, an AVRE advanced along a dike road under fire from 2 bunkers. It fired once, the first bunker vanished in a cloud of debris. Reloading under fire, the crew fired again, the second bunker collapsed. Infantry of the Canadian 3rd Division surged forward, capturing dozens of prisoners. Canadian reports highlight how AVREs were deliberately paired with rifle companies during these battles. The infantry cleared the surrounding fields, the AVRE dealt with the hard points. Without them, Canadian officers admitted, the cost would have been prohibitive. By late 1944, even German officers interrogated after capture spoke of the AVRE with a mixture of respect and resentment. A colonel of the 64th Infantry Division stated, "The English engineer tank with the heavy bomb gun was the most effective weapon against our strong points. We feared it more than artillery, for it came close and destroyed us with certainty." The AVRE was no panacea. It was slow, vulnerable to artillery and anti-tank guns, and dependent on close cooperation with infantry. Yet, where the German MG-42 threatened to freeze an advance, the Flying Dustbin offered one of the few ways to smash through, quickly, decisively, and permanently. By autumn 1944, Allied forces had liberated much of France and Belgium, but the war was far from over. Ahead lay the German border, bristling with defenses built long before the conflict began, the Siegfried Line, or West Wall. It was a network of bunkers, dragon's teeth, and interlocking MG-42 nests designed to halt any invader. To Allied infantry, the thought of charging into this labyrinth of concrete and steel was daunting. To the AVRE, it was precisely the sort of problem it had been built to solve. The Siegfried Line's strength lay not only in its fortifications but in the fields of fire that the MG-42 crews controlled. One well-placed machine gun, firing from a slit embrasure, could dominate an entire sector. Artillery could suppress these guns but rarely destroy the bunkers outright. Infantry who tried to storm them risked annihilation. Once again, commanders turned to Hobart's Funnies. In October 1944, during the Anglo-Canadian assaults on the approaches to Aachen, AVREs were brought forward against hardened strongpoints. The 222nd Assault Squadron recorded. Advanced under covering fire to within 100 yards of bunker. 1 Petard round fired. Embrasure destroyed. Machine gun silenced. Infantry cleared position without casualties. For the men on the ground, the difference was life and death. A private in the 43rd Wessex Division later testified. "We'd been stuck flat for half an hour. Bullets were stitching the earth all around. Then this big Churchill lumbered up, like it didn't care. It fired once, and the bunker that had us pinned just ceased to exist. We couldn't believe it. We cheered like madmen." The Germans, for their part, recognized the danger. Captured reports from the 49th Infantry Division note, "Our troops fear the English engineer tanks with the heavy bomb gun. Conventional machine guns are useless against them. Once they close, the position is lost." Winter slowed the Allied advance, but the AVREs remained active in localized assaults. During Operation Clipper in November 1944, British forces attacked Geilenkirchen, a key Siegfried Line position. AVREs methodically blasted their way through rows of pillboxes, clearing a path for infantry. After the battle, engineers estimated that nearly two-thirds of the German machine gun posts had been neutralized by direct petard fire. Perhaps the most dramatic employment of AVREs came during the Great Rhine crossings in March 1945. The river itself was a formidable natural barrier, and German engineers had reinforced the eastern banks with bunkers, trenches, and MG-42 nests. As the British launched Operation Plunder, the 79th Armoured Division was tasked with ensuring the assault succeeded. At Wesel, AVREs led the way off the amphibious Buffalo landing craft. Under heavy fire, they advanced directly toward riverside bunkers. One sergeant of the 5th Assault Regiment described the action in his after-action report. "Enemy fire was intense. Our leading infantry pinned down. 2 AVREs advanced under smoke. Fired petard charges at close range. Both bunkers destroyed. Enemy fire slackened immediately. Infantry pushed forward. The shock effect was decisive. German defenders who had survived bombardment from artillery and aircraft found their positions erased in seconds by a weapon they had no answer for. Many surrendered rather than face repeated bombardment at such close range." The Rhine crossing also highlighted the versatility of the AVRE. Some carried fascines to fill anti-tank ditches, others laid bobbin trackway to prevent vehicles bogging in the mud. But the petard remained the psychological hammer. Allied engineers recalled the eerie silence that followed each strike. One moment the MG-42's shriek dominated the air, the next it was gone, replaced by dust and echoes. By April, as Allied forces surged into northern Germany, the AVRE had become a familiar sight to infantrymen. Slow and ungainly though it was, soldiers often refused to advance without one in support. To them, the Flying Dustbin was not just a machine, but a shield, and a promise that no bunker or machine gun nest was truly invincible. The Siegfried Line had been touted as impenetrable. It had cost the Allies dearly in artillery shells and infantry lives. But when the AVRE came forward, the myth cracked with every thunderous round. By spring 1945, the war in Western Europe had shifted into its brutal final phase. The Allied armies, having crossed the Rhine, pushed deep into the German heartland. What awaited them were not open battlefields but cities turned into fortresses. Town squares, factories, and even churches were converted into strongpoints, bristling with MG-42s, mortars, and the occasional 20mm flak gun. For infantry, these urban battles were among the most dangerous of the entire campaign. Every street corner was a kill zone, every window a potential machine gun nest. German soldiers, many of them young Volkssturm conscripts mixed with hardened veterans, used the MG-42 to maximum effect. Its ability to fire from the narrowest of apertures made it the perfect weapon for city fighting. To counter this, once again, the Allies turned to the AVRE. In Bremen, April 1945, British forces advancing through the industrial districts were repeatedly stalled by MG-42 fire from reinforced warehouses. Artillery risked leveling entire blocks, but infantry could not advance until the guns were silenced. The solution was methodical. AVREs rolled forward, protected by riflemen and Bren gunners. At one intersection, an AVRE fired a Petard round into the second floor of a warehouse. Witnesses described a blast so violent it tore an entire wall outward, sending machine gun crews and masonry cascading onto the street. Within minutes, the position was neutralized and the infantry pressed on. German defenders were stunned by this close-range demolition. A captured Wehrmacht officer later explained in interrogation. The engineer tank was our nightmare in the cities. We prepared to fight infantry. We even prepared for normal tanks. But the bomb gun destroyed everything in one shot: walls, bunkers, or houses. There was no defense except retreat. The psychological effect cannot be overstated. Many German MG-42 crews, once aggressive in their defense, abandoned positions when they spotted the squat, boxy shape of a Churchill AVRE lumbering into the street. In Hamburg, the story repeated. British units advancing through the heavily defended northern approaches encountered interlocking fire from MG-42s concealed in brick buildings. A platoon pinned for nearly an hour radioed for support. An AVRE arrived, firing 2 Flying Dustbins into. In the years following the war, as armies demobilized and Europe began the slow process of rebuilding, the Churchill AVRE slipped into the background of public memory. Unlike the Sherman or the Tiger, it was not a tank that filled newsreels or adorned post-war posters. Its ungainly appearance and limited role meant it never carried the same glamour. Yet among the soldiers who had depended on it, and the engineers who had built it, the AVRE's legacy was far from forgotten. The Royal Engineers, in particular, remembered the AVRE with pride. At annual reunions, stories resurfaced of how the Flying Dustbin had silenced MG-42 nests at critical moments. In regimental journals, veterans described the strange mix of terror and relief they felt as they rode inside those Churchills. You could never be sure if the blast would bury you or the enemy, one crewman recalled, but every time we fired, it meant our mates outside had a chance to live. Post-war analysis by the British Army confirmed what soldiers had known instinctively: the AVRE had been indispensable during the Normandy campaign. German defenses had been designed with the expectation that ordinary tanks and artillery would falter against hardened bunkers. The Petard mortar gave Allied forces a means of cracking those defenses quickly, without exhausting infantry or wasting artillery that was needed elsewhere. Against the MG-42, the gun that defined German resistance, the AVRE had proven a brutal but reliable countermeasure. The AVRE also influenced future designs. The concept of a combat engineer tank carried forward into the Cold War. On the hulls of Centurions and later Chieftains, new AVREs were developed with modern demolition guns, dozer blades, and mine-clearing equipment. These machines carried the DNA of the Churchill AVRE, not elegant, not numerous, but designed to solve the unsolvable problems of the battlefield. The Petard itself, with its short range and awkward loading, was replaced by more efficient demolition weapons, but the principle remained: engineer tanks could do what no other machine could. For Germany, the memory of facing the AVRE was more sobering. Interrogated Wehrmacht officers admitted that the Petard was one of the few weapons they feared more than artillery barrages. A report compiled from captured diaries of the 352nd Infantry Division described how entire MG-42 crews abandoned their positions after the first blast, leaving their guns still operational but their morale shattered. One veteran later reflected, "We had confidence in our MG. It could cut down hundreds. But against that mortar, we were helpless. One shot, and everything was gone." This asymmetric duel, the fastest gun against the most destructive single blast, became a case study in military academies after 1945. At Sandhurst in the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, instructors used the AVRE as an example of battlefield adaptation. The MG-42 was a weapon of volume and precision, the Petard was a weapon of finality. Together they illustrated how no weapon, however feared, remained invincible once the enemy committed resources to defeating it. Civilian memory of the AVRE was slower to develop. War films of the 1950s and 1960s rarely depicted the ungainly Churchill engineer tank, preferring the more cinematic Sherman or Panther. It was not until specialist historians in the 1980s and 1990s began revisiting Hobart's Funnies that the AVRE re-emerged in popular military history. Today, restored examples at Bovington Tank Museum and memorial parades ensure that the Flying Dustbin's contribution is remembered, not for its beauty, but for its effectiveness. Ultimately, the AVRE's true legacy lies not in museums or manuals but in the men it saved. For every infantryman who crossed an open field without being scythed down by an MG-42, for every section that survived to see the end of the war because a Petard shell silenced the nest in seconds, the AVRE was more than just a machine. It was a shield of steel, clumsy but vital, proof that even the deadliest enemy weapon could be answered with the right blend of imagination and firepower.